So, have you noticed your local library is suddenly closed on weekends, or that road project near your house just disappeared? It's 2026, and the math in New York isn't adding up anymore. We're not talking about a small budget trim. We're looking at a $12 billion gap that's starting to show up in everyday services. While the state figures out how to split the bill, your town is the one dealing with the impact. You've got suburban hospitals sitting on about $18 million in unpaid bills, and school districts like Albany trying to cover an extra $4.5 million just to get through the year. What that really means is your tax dollars are going toward emergency fixes, while the services you actually use start to feel thinner. Today, we're breaking down the top 10 cities in New York where migrant-related costs are putting the most pressure on local budgets in 2026, and we're going to see which places are feeling it the most. If you want more videos like this, hit subscribe, and let's start with number 10. Number 10. Long Island. We're kicking things off with Long Island, specifically those super pricey spots in Nassau and Suffolk counties. Local leaders there were pretty loud earlier this year about not wanting any state-funded shelters in their backyard. Since people here pay some of the highest property taxes on the planet, the "not in my backyard" energy was off the charts. But here's the thing. Zoning laws don't really stop people from finding under-the-table jobs in the suburbs. According to the latest 2026 tracking data, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people quietly moved into these neighborhoods over the last year. They're mostly renting out basements or splitting tiny apartments to keep their costs down. Since Long Island isn't building big fancy shelters, the money pressure shows up in places you wouldn't expect. We're mainly talking about the emergency rooms. When you don't have insurance, you don't call a family doctor, you go straight to the ER for a bad cold. Based on the 2026 figures from the health department, local hospitals are sitting on about $18 million in unpaid bills. Federal law says hospitals have to treat you if you're sick, regardless of your bank account or your paperwork. When the hospitals try to balance their books at the end of the year, that $18 million hole doesn't just go away. It eventually gets passed on to you through higher insurance premiums and state taxes. The transit system's also feeling the squeeze. The local bus system had to find an extra $1.5 million this year just to keep up with all the new riders. Plus, local food pantries spent about $950,000 this past winter just to keep the shelves from going empty. But there's a weird plot twist happening in the background. All these new workers actually made it easier for local landscapers and restaurants to find help. This keeps the cost of getting your lawn mowed or your dinner served from skyrocketing, which actually helps keep local inflation in check. It's a weird trade-off where the county pays for healthcare and buses, but the local businesses get a steady supply of labor. Number 9. Utica. At number 9, we've got Utica. This city has basically survived for years by welcoming refugees to keep the lights on and the population up. The older generations of newcomers actually saved the town by opening shops and fixing up houses that were falling apart. But the current wave's hitting way faster than the city's budget can handle. Utica's taken in about 1,500 new people over the last 18 months. The biggest bill isn't housing, it's the schools. According to the 2026 school district audit, about 45% of the cost to support a new family goes straight into the classroom. That's a massive hit for a city that's already counting its pennies. For the 2025 to 2026 school year, the district's staring at a $3 million hole. They had to go on a hiring spree for ESL teachers and counselors because the state says they have to. When you need specialized teachers, you have to pay the market rate, and that hits the payroll immediately. Medicaid sign-ups in the county also jumped way up this past quarter. Local clinics are basically at max capacity, trying to handle checkups and dental work for hundreds of new patients. Even the fire department's feeling it. Since more people are living in older buildings, EMS calls jumped by $500,000 this year. The water board even had to authorize $700,000 for emergency sewer work because the pipes weren't ready for the extra crowds. On the bright side, the real estate market's doing something interesting. Old buildings that were empty for a decade are finally getting rented out. This means the city's actually collecting property taxes on buildings that used to be worthless. Landlords are getting paid, and they're spending that cash at the local hardware stores. It's basically a balancing act between expensive schools and a downtown that's actually coming back to life. Number 8. Yonkers. Let's talk about Yonkers at number 8. Being right on the edge of NYC makes it the perfect spot for the overflow. Yonkers took in about 2,500 people who couldn't find a bed in the city's main system late last year. The main issue here isn't what the city's spending on shelters. It's the ripple effect on what you pay for rent. When you dump 2,500 people into a town where there are no empty apartments, landlords start seeing dollar signs. Data from early 2026 shows that cheap apartments in Yonkers went up by 20% in just 2 years. That means if you're a local trying to renew your lease, you're probably paying way more than you used to. The Yonkers city budget's mostly dealing with the boring side effects of growth. They had to approve an extra $1.8 million for more police and extra trash pickups. You can't just have 2,500 more people and not expect more garbage on the street. The city's basically begging the state for more cash to cover these bills. Even the building inspectors are working overtime. The city spent $300,000 just on inspectors checking out illegal basement apartments. And since the parks are packed, the maintenance budget went up by $350,000. Most of this comes right out of local property taxes. But it's not all bad news for the city's wallet. All these new residents are buying stuff. Grocery stores and laundromats in Yonkers are having their best year in forever. So the city spends more on trash, but they're quietly raking in more sales tax. Number 7. Syracuse. Moving to number 7, we're looking at Syracuse. This city's usually pretty good at helping new people, but the math is getting tricky. Syracuse added about 1,800 new families to the mix through 2025 and early 2026. The real problem? There's nowhere for them to live. A 2026 housing report showed that Syracuse was already in a crunch before this even started. Over a third of the people there are spending more than half their paycheck just to keep a roof over their head. When new families show up, the wait list for public housing doesn't just grow, it explodes. It's up 45% in the last year. Because of this, the city had to raid its rainy day fund. They pulled $4 million out of their emergency reserves this year. That money's going toward heating bills, electricity help, and keeping the food banks stocked. The housing mess is even hitting the legal system. Public defenders needed an extra $600,000 just to handle all the eviction cases. The city's even spending $1.3 million on motel rooms just to keep long-term residents from sleeping on the street. Pulling $4 million from the reserves is a big deal. It means the city's playing defense with its long-term plans. But there's a silver lining. Because the housing crisis is so documented, Syracuse just landed some huge federal grants. That's millions of dollars coming in to build new affordable housing over the next 5 years. The short-term pain actually forced the federal government to open the checkbook for local developers. Number 6, Buffalo. Number 6 is Buffalo. And this one's a lesson in what happens when communication breaks down. At first, planners thought more people would solve the local labor shortage. But things got messy when the state and local guys stopped talking to each other in late 2025. About 1,000 people were moved into hotels in the suburbs without much of a plan. When you put people in a hotel with no work permit and no support, things get complicated fast. The biggest bill for Buffalo wasn't the hotels. The state pays for those. It was the police overtime. Erie County's 2026 records show they spent an extra $500,000 on cops in just a few weeks. They were mostly just handling small arguments and logistics at the hotels. It got so busy they had to call in the National Guard to help out. The county also had to spend $250,000 on security for bus hubs and $180,000 on translation services. The state said they'd pay the county back, But the checks in the mail is a slow process. The county had to front $500,000 of its own cash, which means they have less money for other stuff right now. Even with the headache, economists think this is actually good for Buffalo in the long run. The city's population is finally stopping its decades-long slide. More people means more federal money for highways and schools down the road. Number 5. Albany. Halfway there at number 5 is Albany. Since it's the capital, they're basically the poster child for the state's relocation plans. They've integrated about 1,100 families through the 2025 to 2026 cycle. The shelter system hit 100% capacity almost immediately. The data shows a weird fight for talent is happening in the school system. The Albany School Board had to spend an extra $4.5 million this year that wasn't in the budget. Most of that went to hiring bilingual teachers and staff. To get them, they had to offer huge salaries, which means they're basically poaching teachers from other towns. This is driving up the cost of education for the whole region. It's not just schools, though. Public libraries are packed, so they needed a $500,000 grant for more security and cleaning. Family courts needed an extra $750,000 just to process all the paperwork. Albany's good at getting state grants, so they aren't broke, but the staff is exhausted. But look at the local businesses. Downtown restaurants and shops are seeing way more people on the sidewalks. All that foot traffic means more sales tax, which helps cover some of those court and library bills. It's basically the state's spending acting like a subsidy for local shop owners. Number 4. Rochester. Number 4 is Rochester, which is actually a bit of a success story if you look at the labor data. They're managing about 1,800 adults in their system right now. According to the April 2026 report, over 65% of them have already found jobs. That's a huge deal. When people work, they pay taxes and stop needing the city to buy them lunch. But there's still a catch. Most of these jobs are entry-level factory or service work paying minimum wage. And since Rochester doesn't have enough cheap housing, these workers are competing with locals for the same few apartments. To keep people from getting evicted, the city moved $2.5 million into rent subsidies. That money had to come from somewhere. A $1.6 million road project was canceled this year to pay for those rent checks. The health department also spent an extra $900,000 on screenings and admin work. So Rochester's basically trading new paved roads for housing stability. But factory owners are loving it. They finally have enough people to run their production lines, which is a big win for the local economy. Number 3. Newburgh. We're at number 3 with Newburgh in Orange County. This town was part of the first wave of hotel moves back in 2023, and they weren't happy about it. Instead of spending money on social services, the county spent it on lawyers. The 2026 budget shows they spent over $400,000 on outside law firms. They were busy filing lawsuits to try and stop the hotels from taking in new people. That's $400,000 of taxpayer money that went to legal fees instead of fixing potholes. While the lawyers were arguing, the pipes were struggling. The city had to spend $150,000 on emergency water and sewer testing because the hotels were so crowded. The county's also losing money on hotel taxes. Since the rooms are being used for housing, tourists can't stay there, which cost the county about $300,000 in lost taxes. It turns out fighting the state can be just as expensive as working with them. But the local corner stores are thriving. The grocery stores and pharmacies right next to the hotels are doing record business. The county's losing tax money, but the neighborhood businesses are having a field day. Number 2, Rockland County. Number 2 is Rockland County. Their vibe has been strictly no, and they've backed it up with some aggressive rules. They were worried their old sewers and school lines couldn't handle more people. So, they decided to find their way out of the problem. The county's been hitting non-compliant hotels with $2,500 a day fines. They even hired private investigators to watch the bus routes and see who's coming in. The 2026 filings show the county spent $600,000 just on police overtime and those investigators. All that aggressive enforcement actually scared off some local businesses, too. The county thinks they lost about $500,000 in tax revenue from shops that closed down during the crackdown. It's a high price to pay for keeping people out. But there's a specific reason they're doing it. By keeping the numbers low, they saved their school budgets from changing at all. They basically spent $600,000 on cops to avoid spending millions on new classrooms. Whether that's a good trade is up to the voters, but the math is clear. Number 1, New York City. We've made it to number 1, the Big Apple. The latest data shows over 230,000 people have come through the intake system since this all started. Everyone's been talking about that $12 billion hole in the budget, but the April 2026 audit tells a much different story. The city isn't going under. In fact, it's looking at a $2.5 billion surplus for 2026. How? Well, they got a $4.5 billion check from the state, and they changed the rules. They limited shelter stays to 30 or 60 days, which kicked people out of the expensive system faster. The daily cost per person dropped from $383 down to $340. When you're dealing with thousands of people, that $43 saving adds up to hundreds of millions. But the budget still has some eye-popping numbers. The debit card program for food is costing about $55 million. And leasing warehouses to store people's stuff costs $13 million every single month. To get that $2.5 billion surplus, the city cut some things people actually like. They trimmed the library hours, cut back on pre-K, and stopped hiring as many cops. So the city's rich on paper, but you might notice the library's closed on Sundays. On the flip side, sales tax is way up. Between the federal aid money and new wages, people are spending like crazy in the 5 boroughs. Conclusion. When you actually look at the 2026 audit reports, the New York is dying story starts to fall apart. Don't get me wrong, things are definitely being squeezed. Money that used to go to parks and roads is now going to ESL teachers, ER bills, and lawyers. But the idea that these cities are falling into a black hole of debt just isn't true. Between the state stepping in with billions and the local cities cutting their own budgets, the system's holding together. The real story isn't bankruptcy. It's a shift in what your tax dollars are doing. Life's getting a little more expensive and public services are getting a little thinner, but the checks are still clearing. So, how do you feel about where the money's going? Is the state doing a good job managing the chaos, or are we just pushing a giant tax hike down the road? Drop a comment below and let me know what's happening in your town. If you like these deep dives into the actual receipts, give this video a like and hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.